Hi, I'm Miranda Vaughn. I'm a reference and archives librarian here at the Mississippi Library Commission, and this is the fourth and final part of our four-part series on researching Black ancestry. So let's get started. So part 4, if you have not seen our previous 3 videos, definitely go back and watch them. They have a lot of really helpful information, and we talked about national records and Mississippi records. So definitely check those out. Today's, today's episode, or today's video, is going to be just talking about additional resources and guides and advice that we haven't really covered or covered thoroughly in some of the other videos. As I've said before, this series is not to show you every single resource. It's just mostly to give you an idea of what kind of resources are out there, kind of explain how to navigate some of the websites and databases, and give you an idea of some of the more helpful and most used resources out there, and to let you know what institutions hold what documents, so that when you're doing your research or when you are helping someone else with their family research, you kind of know where to look for things. So we're just going to cover a few more today. First, I want to talk a little bit about Freedmen's Bank records. We've already talked about the Freedmen's Bureau a little bit in our past videos. They have a lot of good information about African Americans right after the Civil War and early in the Reconstruction era. But the Freedmen's Bank is a little bit different. Open this up here. So they were established to work similarly to the Freedmen's Bureau. They were another way that the federal government kind of came in and established law and order in the South after the Civil War to try to get recently emancipated enslaved people on their feet, financially, socioeconomically, all that. And so the Freedmen's Bank served as essentially a bank for formerly enslaved people. The official name is the Freedmen's Saving and Trust Company, and they lasted from 1865 to 1874. They weren't around a long time. There was just a lot of issues with the way the federal government handled things, a lot of the protections that they were supposed to be putting into place they weren't really following through with. So there's just a lot of issues, human error, all that. So they closed after a few years. But if you go to the National Archives website where I am now, it has a list of the Freedmen's Bank records that are available that have surviving signatures of depositors and indexes to ledgers. So if you scroll down to the Mississippi area, Columbus, Mississippi does not have those surviving records. Natchez, Mississippi and Vicksburg do. So that just gives you an idea of which records to look for in Mississippi. The National Archives has these records on microfilm, and they have some that are print version. Mostly what it's going to be is certificates of deposit, like I said, indexes. They were very particular about recording family information because one of the protections that they offered was not allowing outside people to come in and take their money and their assets. So they were pretty tedious about recording, family names, addresses, things like that. So that's the kind of information you're going to find. There's also some correspondence between some of the depositors and the people who ran the bank. So you might find some information in those too. I think most of those are going to be in print. There may be some on microfilm. But the National Archives has them in-house. Some of the regional facilities have them as well, but the Washington, D.C. like headquarters of the National Archives houses all of them. And you can also search them on Ancestry.com and on Family Search. And there may be some other repositories that I've missed that also have access to them as well, but these are the most popular ways to access them. And of course, you just go to Ancestry.com, and the same way you would search census records and all of that, you do the same kind of searching. And if they have records through the Freedmen's Bank, it will tell you. And of course, this down here gives you an idea of what kind of information is on those records also. So very good resource for Freedmen's Bank records. Another resource that you probably don't think about quite as much, but can have some pretty good information is the Daughters of the American Revolution records. The Daughters of the American Revolution is an organization, I think they're mostly like civics and community service and whatnot, but in order to be a part of the organization, you have to be able to provide genealogical evidence that links you to an American Revolution or Revolutionary War soldier. And they've been around for a very long time. I'm going to go to their website now. So since they've been around for a long time, you have a lot of repetitive genealogies. You have a lot of different people who are going to have the same ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War. So they have recorded and indexed a lot of the genealogies that have already been done, so that if you do have an ancestor who fought in that war and you want to be a part of this organization, you can look at what they already have available and just kind of fill in your personal family history where you need to. But the Revolutionary War did have some Black soldiers. Some fought on the Patriot side and some fought on the Loyalist side. So it just kind of depends. But they have a Patriots of Color genealogy site here that is searchable. So if you do have an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War, then you may be able to find where someone else has already done genealogy research on them on this site, and that can be super helpful if that is the case. So I wanted to throw that out there also as a possible resource. And then the Our Black Ancestry Foundation, it operates similarly to RootsWeb, which I talked about in our national records video. It's just kind of a consolidated website that gives you a bunch of different resources that are particular or specific to Black ancestry. They have free resources on here, tutorials, videos, and things like that. And then you can also pay $25 a year to become a member, and you get access to all of this. So as I've said with other organizations, when it comes to paying for subscriptions and things, a lot of times those are really worth it, and sometimes it's just not. So it's really good to just do your research and figure out what works best for you. You know, if you're on a time crunch or you're really not confident in your research, it might be helpful to pay to some of these subscriptions so that it might make the job a little bit easier. But it's just a matter of you weighing the pros and cons and making that decision for yourself. But this is one that has some free resources and some are paid. So just wanted to let you know about those. And back to the Freedmen's Bank, just here in the corner gives you an idea of what the bank book looked like, or the cover here. Of course, you can see this one's from Lexington, Kentucky, but that just gives you an idea of what the documents will look like or be similar to. Black ancestry and Native Americans. This is something else that isn't talked about quite as much in researching Black ancestry or genealogy in general. And part of that is because the records are lacking. There just hasn't been a very big push over the years to include Native Americans in the conversation when it comes to Black ancestry or any ancestry, to be honest. But it's something that historians, archivists are really working on compiling, more and more evidence, or more and more documentation, and preserving more and more records that relate to underrepresented people. And so hopefully over the coming years, we will get more insight into what life was like for Native Americans and Black people who assimilated with one another. But just wanted to give you a little background information on the history of African Americans and Native Americans. So to start off, Native Americans and Africans worked alongside each other as slaves or indentured servants pretty early on in our history. What eventually became this institution of slavery and the slave trade really started out as indentured servitude, which was just like contracts and stuff. But so a lot of the Native American slaves started out more as indentured servants, but due to exposure to European diseases and things like that, a lot of them didn't really survive the way that the Africans had, who had been exposed to Europeans for a lot longer and had developed immunities and that sort of thing. But they did start out, clearly not all Native Americans were enslaved, but there were some Native Americans who were enslaved. So that's kind of where they started out in their relationship. Over the years, there were Native Americans who owned their own slaves and participated in the slave trade. The 5 civilized tribes is a term that has come to be associated with the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes. And all that means is that those are kind of the top 5 tribes that were considered, they adapted more easily to European tradition and the European settlers. Most of those tribes are located in, well, I think all of those tribes are located in the Southeast. And just communication between Europeans and those tribes seemed to go a little bit better, and they seem to be more easily assimilated to European culture. So that's why they were dubbed the 5 civilized tribes. And so a lot of the information that we have on Native Americans is going to be related to those tribes. So if you do have Native American ancestry, it's likely that you will be part of one of these tribes, or at least use their records for your research. The Dawes Rolls are one of the top genealogical resources when it comes to Native American history. As I mentioned before, because you did have, not only did you have Native Americans who owned slaves, and even before that, Native Americans who were slaves, but you also had like runaway slaves and freedmen of color who would sort of take refuge with Native Americans. And so you had a lot of intermixing, a lot of, interracial procreation and all of that. So you do end up with a lot of what is termed Black Indians. And so these Dawes Rolls were a result of the Dawes Act from 1887, I believe. And the Dawes Act basically just broke up a lot of the reservation land that the United States already had for Native Americans. And the Native Americans had to apply individually or per family and they would get their own plot of land. So it was just a new way of dividing everything up so that these families were able to like get their own farms and their own family land. So these Dawes rolls are the rolls where they kept these lists of Native Americans who were getting this land or applying for this land. So you're going to have information about the land itself, and you're going to have information as far as like names and that sort of thing. The National Archives has information about these Dawes records on their website here. If you scroll down here, it gives you an idea of what kind of information is on these records. You have census cards, enrollment jackets, and land allotment jackets that are available in these records. And then it tells you under each of them what kind of information is available on those records. And as you can see here, it tells you where they're available. Most of them are available at ancestry.com or familysearch.org, which of course we've talked about in the past. And there's also this website called fold3.com that I haven't talked about before. I've never used it personally, but I've seen it amongst genealogy resources. It's mostly focused on military records. So that's another little freebie option that I'm throwing in there too. But yeah, if you're wanting to get an idea of what information is available on those records, you can go here and look. And then the Mississippi Department of Archives and History also has access to Dawes rolls for the state of Mississippi. I believe they're on microfilm. So that's where you can retrieve the Mississippi Dawes rolls. You can also find information about Native American ancestry through county records. I've talked about the WPA records in the past, that they include information about Native Americans. Usually every county that I've ever looked in on those records has had information about Native Americans who lived in that area, especially if there were any schools or organizations or anything that pertain to Native Americans. They would usually be mentioned at some point in there. And just for reference, also, there is the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians website, and they have a genealogy. This is their history section, but then they have a genealogy section too that gives you some interesting information that can be really helpful in your search. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians is probably going to be the most popular Native American organization that you're going to find in Mississippi. There's a lot of Choctaw Indians here. There were some Chickasaw as well, and of course Natchez. But a lot of the ancestry that I know that I've worked with has been linked back to the Choctaw Indians. So this can be a helpful resource also. I also wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about interpreting these documents. I've mentioned them several times throughout the course of this series, but I haven't really broken down what each of these types of records means, and what kinds of things that they contain. And so I wanted to make sure that I covered all my bases as far as people who are on different levels in their research. So if you're a complete newbie, have no idea what you're doing, this is the first time you're seeing anything about genealogy research, first time you're seeing these records, just wanted to give you just a quick tutorial of how to navigate some of these more popular records that you're going to be finding and using in your research. So starting off, of course, with birth records, they are going to contain, of course, your date of birth, birthplace, parent information. They often contain like mother's maiden name. They can possibly contain information about like whether your parents are married, whether there are other children. It just depends on what state we're talking about. It depends on what time period we're talking about, because you know they change over time what kind of information is required and what kind isn't. You also have like the formal birth certificate, and that obviously is going to be the number one thing that you're looking for, but there are also informal birth records that can also be just as helpful. There are like certificates that are not the birth certificate, but they're like kind of a receipt saying that there is a birth certificate out there, but like maybe the person doesn't have their birth certificate, you know, in their personal possession. They might have these little certificates of birth that tell you that one exists. It's just not in that person's possession. So don't be confused about that, like if that's the actual birth certificate or just what I would consider a receipt. And then you also, of course, have family Bibles, personal family records, you know, recorded journals and whatnot, however your family might have recorded births, just, you know, a grandmother or whoever, family matriarch or patriarch, including or maintaining a list of birthdays, death dates, marriage dates, and all of that. So all of that can be helpful and gives you information about births. Then we also have marriage records that are going to give you the groom's name, the bride's name, dates, of course. It's going to include their dates of birth, any witnesses, names there. Sometimes they can include parent information as well. They can give you a lot of information, and sometimes it's hard to find marriage records. Sometimes they don't exist, but if you can't find them in the county that you feel like they should be in, then check surrounding counties, check surrounding states. It's very common and has been very common for a number of years for people to get married outside of the state, outside of the county. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to find a marriage record in another county or another state. So definitely check there as well. And as far as marriage records go, again, just like with the birth certificates, the number one thing you're going to be looking for is like a marriage certificate, or at least some sort of list of marriages when you're looking at like old county records. But there are a couple of different types of records, marriage records, that I wanted to point out. Some of these I didn't even know about. So we're all learning together. So you have marriage bonds, which are financial guarantees that a marriage is going to take place. So sometimes you will find those, and those will have dates on them, not to be confused with the actual wedding date. You also have marriage banns, which were proclamations that were put out by whatever church you were planning on getting married in. It's basically like their official announcement. And those can be found in a number of different repositories, but most likely church records is going to be your go-to for that. Marriage licenses grant permission to marry, and then you have the actual certificates that certify on that day that those marriages took place. So some of these different documentations you might find, and they're going to be very helpful for looking at names and that sort of thing, but just pay attention to the dates on those, because some of those are not going to be the actual wedding date. They're going to be prior to, most likely. And just to give you an idea of what a marriage bond might look like, you may not be able to see this really great because I don't think it'll let me make it bigger, but this is an example of an 1816 marriage bond out of North Carolina, and it's basically just like an official statement that you're engaged and you're going to get married and all that. So if you come across those, again, very helpful information. Just pay attention to the date so that you don't get things confused when it comes to the marriage date versus another date that might be associated. And then you have death records, which are some of the newer records that are available for genealogy research, because death records weren't required for a long time. In fact, Mississippi started requiring death records in 1912. So you're not going to find any official death records before 1912. And you only have access to death certificates 50 years from the date of death. So that only provides you with a small window of time that you can find death records. If you are needing a death record or death certificate for an ancestor, those are not going to be housed at any kind of archives or libraries. Those are going to be housed in Mississippi, at least, in the Vital Records Department at the Mississippi Department of Health. And this is where you can go to retrieve those on their website. You can also order birth certificates as well and marriage records. They have like a frequently asked questions page that has some genealogy information on it. They do require you to like show valid ID and all of that. So it can be a little bit tricky to get a copy of death certificates. But if you need one, this is where you go to retrieve those. And if you're needing some sort of death records and documentation from before 1912, my advice is just to look at cemetery records and church records, because those are going to have information about, you know, if there's a family plot, you can connect people through family plots that what you would see in cemetery records and church records and places like Find a Grave. So if you're looking for something like that before 1912, don't fret just because there's not a death certificate. There still might be documentation out there. So I also wanted to mention, and this is a little bit of a downer, but it's also important. So I did want to make sure that I pointed out in this series some information that you might not think about until you actually get in the middle of your research. And it's one of those things is the idea of people versus property. Keep in mind when you are researching Black ancestry, if you are looking at information from before 1865, from before emancipation, you are not looking for the names of people, although there are some enslaved people who did have names, but you're not researching with the intent to find people. You are researching with the intent to find property, because that is what enslaved people were considered. And when you're looking at records, you're going to find them listed amongst the property. So it's important to keep that in mind, as difficult as it may be to wrap your mind around that very dark time in history. That is something that you need to keep in mind, because that's going to affect the way that you research. So when thinking about property, where would you find lists of property? Most likely in estate inventories, land deeds and wills, tax documentation. So, you know, financial documents can be pretty helpful when you're looking at pre-emancipation records. Records of sale, court records, if you're finding court cases where there have been enslavers who are, you know, fighting over land, or somebody is suing somebody else, anything that might include a list of assets or information about some of their assets. Those might include information about enslaved people recorded as their assets or their property. So keep that in mind if you're researching before 1865, that you are looking for list of property, and that's most likely where you're going to find information if you have enslaved ancestors. And I believe I talked a little bit about manifests and slave schedules in a previous video, but I did want to go over those again because those can also be helpful. So manifests were implemented in 1808 as a part of the official ban on the transatlantic slave trade. And what they are is just documentation that was meant to regulate the shipment of slave cargo along coastal waters, and just to ensure that you weren't getting, you know, imported slaves from Africa or Europe, and to keep that regulated. So if you were shipping enslaved people from, you know, New York to South Carolina or whatever, along coastal coastal waters. Whoever was over the ship would have to fill out this form and put information about any enslaved people that were included on that ship. Usually this includes a name, age, height, gender, the port of destination where they were going, and whoever the shipper was or whoever the owner of the enslaved person was, their information would be on that as well. So that, of course, providing that information can be helpful, and especially if you're not really sure how your ancestor got from one place to the other, or you're not sure like where to look because you know that they've moved. Clearly this is recording enslaved people as they are traveling, so that can be very helpful in putting together the puzzle pieces to figure out how your ancestors got to whatever place they got to. And then slave schedules was the last one that I wanted to talk a little bit about. These were on the 1850 and 1860 census, so we don't have just like a ton of them since they weren't around for that long, but they provide some really good information. This is just an example of what they look like. This is a slave schedule from Charleston, South Carolina. As you can see, it would have the owner or the estate, and then underneath, you don't have names of people, but you have information about them, the number of slaves, their age, sex, color. You have information over here to the right about whether or not they were a fugitive, if they have any kind of physical impairments. It looks like there's one of a 70-year-old female down here who is blind. So all of that is listed. As you can see, they have ages as young as a few months old. So that can give you a lot of information about the owners or the enslavers. And it doesn't have names, but it does have descriptors here that can possibly be helpful. So that's what those look like, and you can find those on Ancestry.com and a couple of other places too. And then, being a librarian, of course, I'm going to have some book recommendations. There are a lot of good ones out there, so this is not a completed list. Of course, this is just a few that we have here in-house at MLC and some that I use for my research for this series. So I just wanted to point some of them out. First, we have Black Indian genealogy research, which I have here, and you can see on the screen. And this gives you information about the five civilized tribes, and just history, background information about their relationships with African Americans, and kind of how to go about doing genealogy if you have Native American ancestry. So very good resource. I advise you to check it out if that's of interest to you. Then we also have Black Genesis, a resource book for African American genealogy. This is essentially, I would say, a little bit of a bibliography, I guess. It's divided up by states, and then it just kind of gives you as many resources as possible about where you can find information on Black genealogy in each state. So let's see, this came out in 2003. So there might be some updated stuff as well. But this is a good starting place to give you an idea of what kind of resources are available as well. Resources that obviously we didn't cover in this series since there just wasn't enough time. So check that one out as well. And then I also wanted to recommend this one, The Origins of American Slavery. It's real small, like a quick read. And just to give you an idea, if you get to the point to where you are researching your family history and you are dealing with enslaved people, it's good to just kind of get a history, a background, if you don't already have one and you would like to learn more, just about how it all started. And that can be helpful just in your knowledge and like having background and history about this sort of thing is always helpful in genealogy research. So if you're interested in learning more about the history of slavery in our country, definitely check that one out too. Just wanting to wrap this up, we have had some really great responses from some of our libraries here in Mississippi. So we have created, or we're in the process of creating, handouts and, well, kind of like syllabi to go along with each of these videos. So if you're interested in having those handouts, we can email them to you. Just contact our reference staff. We'd be glad to get those to you. And they just go along with each video, because you can use, if you're a librarian or an archivist, you can use these videos to help educate your own patrons as well. So if those handouts would be helpful, we can get those to you. I'm also going to make the PowerPoint presentations for this series available in PDF format, so we can send those to you as well. And then we also have a virtual panel discussion that's coming up at the end of March, March 25th, I believe, where we're going to be discussing researching Black ancestry with a lot of really great genealogists and librarians and archivists in the state of Mississippi. All of them have are related to some of the institutions that we have talked about already in this series. So it'll be really great to hear what they had to say, that they are all really professional people with a lot of interesting backgrounds, and they can tell you what their institutions have that might be helpful that we haven't covered in this series. So we will be putting information about that out on our social media platforms. If you don't follow the Library Commission on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, definitely do that, because we'll be putting out announcements about that, and I'm sure through our listserv as well. So be looking out for information about that. And again, this is the contact information for our reference staff here at MLC. You can email us, call us with any questions that you have about this series or any genealogy research. We're glad to answer any of your questions. So thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a lot of great fun and a great learning experience for me putting this series together, and I hope that it has been informative and helpful to you as well. So thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time.